It's cold out, it's snowing in New York. So let's talk about UAP. So, what I want to do is continue recommending awesome content on YouTube, on other podcasts. So many great ones to choose from. And today, I want to talk about Whitley Strieber's incredible appearance on Jesse Michels. So I was really pleasantly surprised. I don't know. With this particular episode. Over the years, like many people, I wasn't sure about Whitley. He's a horror writer. He says he had these encounters in his cabin up here, north of where I am in the Catskills. So that's kind of a Hudson Valley area sighting, right? During the big flap, the Hudson Valley flap of the 1980s. Many of you of a certain age know all about Whitley Strieber's experience. Also made into a movie, Communion. His book came out in somewheres around mid to late 80s. I forget the exact year. And that cover of the gray with the yellowish skin and the big eyes freaked out a lot of people in the 80s when they saw that book, when they were passing by in the bookstore or the library. And it had such a visceral effect on some people, they realized that they might have had experiences as well. But this is one of the first times, the cover of that book, that the Greys had their image out there. Bud Hopkins, there were some drawings in his books, early 1980s, but this was huge. This was, and I think he calls her a her. She had an impact on a lot of people, this cover. And you see when he is speaking from his home, he has a picture of her portrait in the background on his wall. So people of a younger age who are not as familiar with Whitley Strieber, he is a horror writer. He wrote The Wolf and some other horror novels, and then Communion about his supposed own experience. And since Communion, he's written multiple books about that experience, letters he received from others who claim to have had similar interactions with non-human intelligence. He most recently wrote a book about Jesus. So what I took from this interview, one of the takeaways was this man is, believe him or not, or the 100%, right? Is he embellishing some things because he's a writer? All right. But this man, no doubt, is kind of a genius, kind of an American genius, creative. In terms of his writing, but then if you watch this, you get a sense of his intellectual genius too. And that's what I loved about this. This episode was kind of philosophical mental gymnastics exercise in thinking about consciousness, about the phenomenon, about philosophy, about a lot of different things. And if you like to have your brain exercised and challenged in that way, I highly recommend it. And this Jesse Michels is a really great interviewer, along with his friend who sits there for a lot of these interviews. So one of the most profound points he makes in this particular interview, which I had never heard, was this concept that if we believe in the NHI, they will then manifest. That we actually have to allow them into our reality to manifest them, and that this is a requirement. And once that door opens, he argues that we won't be able to get rid of them. The door goes in one direction. Once we allow them into our human consciousness, They're here to stay, and we have to be careful how we let them in, how we allow them in. This concept also that they can come in, but on our terms, that we have to maintain sovereignty over our reality, which is just a fascinating concept when you think about it. We know from some of the literature, from the experience or stories in literature, that sometimes people experience NHI in different ways. Witnesses of objects, for example, um, they may see the same, supposedly the same object, but it looks different to each of the witnesses, or one person sees it and another does not. Um, so the concept of we all sort of have our own reality. And so that leads me to ask, if some of us allow that reality in of NHI, but some do not, some don't believe it, how does that manifest? Anyway, it's this mental gymnastics about this concept that is bounced back and forth, and I loved it. It was, you can throw around the fancy words ontological and epistemology. This has to do with the nature of knowledge, the nature of how we come to know things. So if you like that stuff, great. But it's not all that. A lot of it is about his experiences and some things that maybe you haven't necessarily ever heard. He throws around some names, and the interviewer seemed to be familiar with these people. I actually had never heard of them, but they were apparently insiders in the 1950s about the phenomenon. He mentions a von Neumann. He mentions a Sarah Baker. So I would suggest you read about them, perhaps. They're very important figures from way back, in terms of government involvement and secrecy of UFOs back then. And he had some interesting interactions with them and some stories about them. He also talks about his own experiences in terms of the implant, which is kind of a famous part of his story because he had X-rays, MRIs, and he actually had a doctor go in there and try to remove it at one point. And there is a video of, and they show it, part of it, of this doctor trying to get it out, and it's moving. It's moving, and he talks about them trying to figure out the frequency being emitted from this object. So all the scientific tests and how it behaved. Whitley Strieber talks about how this implant in the back of his ear, and Jesse Michels gets up and feels it. It's kind of a funny part of the interview. He says that it activated in 2015, but he had received it much earlier than that by some mysterious human beings who entered his house. I mean, there's so many layers to Whitley Strieber's story. That's why people get skeptical. It does become this fanciful horror slash spiritual slash, it's very complex. You have to break it down, and you have to decide what you believe. If he's stretching the truth at all, or thinks he's telling everything as it is, but it's become convoluted in his mind at some point. But you know what? It's almost like, watch this interview, it becomes besides the point, because the man is very special in his intelligence and his outlook and his interpretation of the UAP subject, and consciousness and spirituality, the spiritual element of it. It's just worth it, even if you didn't 100% believe his story. But the part where he talks about it activating in like 2015, he connects that to the death of his wife, who he was very, very close to, and that somehow her passing had something to do with the activation of the object, and that these implants can be traced back to a scientist from Eastern Europe who developed this technology. So he's implying it's a human thing. That human beings are putting these implants in other human beings. I wasn't 100% following that. But there is a deep spiritual element to his story, which is interesting considering Chris Bledsoe and some others. But he says 3 a.m. is like this magical time where it's the highest commune with God. It's known across cultures, 3 a.m. But there's a physical element to it that has to do with melatonin. Anyway, this 3 a.m. hour is when this thing gets activated and he communes with beings. And there's a spiritual element of it, NHI element of it. I think he calls it a sacred mix of NHI and spirits. And he's gotten so much information at this 3 a.m. hour, night after night, it's continuing, and he wouldn't change it for anything. And he talks about this slit in his eye where he sees letters, he sees words, it has something to do with the implant, and his wife's passing, and he felt like he got a message through the implant, or what he sees through his eye, that the words formed some message from her. It's a lot from him. But they do try to tie together some overarching themes. He says there's 2 recurring themes that he believes in, having to do with his experiences in the larger phenomenon. He says we are more than physical, and we have more value than we recognize. He says human beings are very special because we're journeyers, we're travelers, we have a soul, we have a spirit, which a lot of NHI seem to be interested in. How does your soul get in there? How does your soul get in there? We can't touch your soul, as the praying mantis said to Dr. Blitch. And they're in a way envious that we can take the human journey. I wonder if this has something to do with an ability to reincarnate. If they're implying that is special, or just that we can have souls. Maybe some of them are AI. Maybe they live forever. They don't have a soul. They don't have sentience. I don't know. It's a fascinating part of this whole thing, though. But those are the 2 themes he wants us to be cognizant of, that he thinks are very important in this overarching experience. We are more than physical, and we have more value than we recognize. Another segue in the interview was his discussion about hybrids among us, and he feels that these highly autistic, unworded people who do not speak, who are highly autistic, may be hybrids. I thought he was going to say it's, pale beings that look human with the blonde wispy hair, strange eyes, whatever. Oh my God, they're like next to you in the restaurant. They're your neighbor, look in their eye, blah, blah, all this. No, none of that. He feels that these highly autistic people, which he describes as a community of these folks, that seem to have telepathic abilities, and this is discussed in the telepathy tapes, by the way. But he's getting to know this community of people, and he has some telepathic abilities, and he says that he can communicate with them, they communicate with each other. He wants them to be more integrated into society somehow. They're very isolated, yet they're very highly intelligent, telepathic individuals. So that discussion was very interesting too. So he says 2025 is about figuring out how to live together. They don't want us to be their slaves. They want to come here. They want they want to live sort of as companions. They don't want us to look to them as gods. That's his opinion. And he doesn't want us to be. They don't want us to be their slaves. And he also talks about human involvement in the abduction scenarios. Mentions Dr. Richard Dolan's opinion that there's a breakaway civilization of people who are involved in this, which I found thought-provoking. Because a lot of people who get abducted by creatures, they claim to see regular people involved in it. I don't know what that's all about. He also says we have to go back to an understanding of ourselves, which is a common theme mentioned by the whistleblowers as well, that we've forgotten who we are and our gifts and our power. So that's about it. That's one of the ones I recommend, and I'm going to continue to watch what I can and do these recommendations because these are very long interviews and it's hard to know with everything coming out what to watch, what's worthwhile. And they're very long. So this is my Cliff Notes for you. And please, in the comments, share the videos and information you've been taking in and what you recommend to others, what you think is interesting. And I'll see you in the next one. Bye.